The first time it happened, Sarah Chen almost laughed. She'd been inside her house, working from her home office on a Thursday afternoon in late June, when the sound of splashing erupted from her backyard. Not the soft, contemplative sounds of someone taking a swim, but the cacophony of teenage chaos. Voices cracking with laughter, the wet slap of cannonballs, someone's phone blasting a bass-heavy remix that made her coffee cup vibrate on her desk. Sarah stood up and moved to the window. 7 teenagers were in her pool, not her backyard, not near her pool, in it. They'd clearly come through the gap in the fence that the previous owners had promised to repair before selling. The gap was large enough for a determined person to squeeze through, and apparently large enough for a pack of neighborhood kids to view as an open invitation to pool paradise. She watched for a moment, calculating whether this was worth the confrontation. The pool had been installed 8 months ago, an investment that had cost her $45,000 and represented years of careful financial planning. It wasn't just a luxury. It was therapy. Something about floating in warm water at the end of a long day, staring up at the sky, had become essential to her mental health since the divorce. Sarah grabbed a cardigan and headed outside. "Hey," she called out, her voice cutting through the music like a knife. "Hey, everyone out now." The teenagers froze. For a moment, there was that perfect beat of silence where everyone realizes they've been caught. Then a girl, maybe 16, with intricate braids and a piercing in her nostril, spoke up. "Oh my God, chill, we're just having fun. This pool's huge. You're not using it." The audacity was almost admirable. "I own this pool," Sarah said, her voice controlled but sharp. "And I own this property. You are trespassing." A boy climbed out of the water, leaving wet footprints across her deck. He was tall, maybe 18, with the kind of casual confidence that comes from a lifetime of not hearing the word no. "Look, lady, there's like 1,000,000 empty pools in this neighborhood and nobody uses them during the day. We're not hurting anything. You need to leave, now, before I call the police." It wasn't a bluff. Sarah meant it. She was a woman who'd learned to mean things after her divorce from Michael, a man who'd spent 5 years systematically eroding her ability to trust her own judgment. Now, at 42, she'd reclaimed her house, her decisions, and her right to say no without explanation. The teenagers exchanged glances. There was a moment where she could see them calculating. Then, with theatrical sighs and eye rolls, they pulled themselves out of the water, gathered their belongings, and filed toward the fence. The last one out, the girl with the braids, turned back. "You know, you could just let people use it," she said. "Like, what difference does it make?" "It makes every difference," Sarah replied. "It's mine." That night, Sarah stood at her kitchen window with a glass of wine, watching the empty pool glow blue in the darkness. She'd had the fence repaired first thing Friday morning. $80 and it was done. Problem solved. Except it wasn't. The following Tuesday, she found muddy footprints on her deck and wet towels draped over her lounge chairs. The teenagers had squeezed through again, this time with a different group. More kids, louder music, and what looked like an actual party. There were at least 15 of them when she stepped outside, and this time none of them looked particularly concerned about being discovered. "Pool's open, I guess," one of them, a younger kid maybe 14, said to his friend. "Free Wi-Fi too, probably." Sarah called the police. The dispatcher was kind but dismissive. "They're in the water, not in your house. Without direct evidence of property damage, it's going to be hard to make anything stick. I can send a car by, but it might take a while. Maybe just reinforce your fence." Sarah had reinforced her fence. She'd paid for a more robust solution, metal slats 6 feet high, professionally installed. $2,000. The new fence was beautiful, actually, sleek and modern. It looked like something from a design magazine. It lasted 6 days. She came home from a meeting to find the fence partially dismantled on the back corner, the metal slats carefully pried apart just enough to create an opening. Her beautiful, expensive fence had become a puzzle to be solved, and apparently these teenagers were good at solving puzzles. That night, she installed a lock on the gate. The lock lasted 4 days. By the time they got the bolt cutters in, Sarah had stopped being angry. She'd moved past anger into something more complex, a cold, calculating awareness that this problem required a different kind of solution. The neighborhood Facebook group was full of similar complaints. The Riverside Pool Bandit posts, she learned they were called, a mysterious group of teenagers who targeted homes with pools, using social media to coordinate which houses would be hit on which days. Apparently, Sarah's property had become famous on their private group chat. The easiest pool in the district, someone had written in a screenshot a neighbor shared. No real security. Old lady too nice to do anything about it. Old lady, Sarah was 42. She began researching security systems. Cameras, alarms, pressure sensors, motion detectors. She learned about aquatic security technology, UV sensors, RFID systems, even some kind of drone-based surveillance setup. The prices were astronomical. Thousands and thousands of dollars for equipment that still might not work. But there was one solution that kept appearing in security forums, something that made her pause. It started as a joke, really, a comment on a Reddit thread about pool security. Get one of those shark alarms, the kids will never come back. Someone else had responded, better yet, get a salt chlorine generator and set it to maximum, burn their eyes out, problem solved. Both were ridiculous, obviously, but they were also funny in a way that resonated with Sarah's growing desperation. She spent a Wednesday evening in her home office researching marine security systems. Most of them were designed for harbors and marinas, using ultrasonic frequencies to keep animals away from docked boats. They worked by emitting a sound that animals found distressing, a frequency that human ears couldn't quite hear, at least not consciously. It would just feel wrong, uncomfortable, wrong enough that most people would leave. The company was called AquaGuard Technologies. She read through their whole website, learning about their flagship product, the Marine Perimeter Defender. It looked like nothing, just a metallic box about the size of a cinder block. You submerged it in the water, set the frequency and intensity, and it created a barrier that would keep unauthorized swimmers out. It wasn't harmful, the website assured her. It was non-invasive and completely safe. It simply created an uncomfortable sensation that discouraged trespassing. Like a very sophisticated, do not enter sign that your body understood even if your brain didn't. The description included a line that made her smile. Perfect for keeping unauthorized swimmers from accessing your property. The price was reasonable, $1,800, and they offered a money-back guarantee if it didn't work. Sarah filled out the order form at midnight. By Friday, the device arrived in an unmarked brown box. It was heavier than she expected, made of brushed steel and titanium with a digital control panel on top. The manual was thorough, 70 pages of technical specifications, frequency recommendations, legal disclaimers. According to the paperwork, the device was completely legal to use on your own property, created no permanent harm, and had been used by marine facilities, harbors, and private residences across the country. That Saturday morning, Sarah stood at the edge of her pool with the device in her hands, the instruction manual open on the deck. She read the legal disclaimer one more time. By activating this device, you acknowledge that you are the rightful owner of this property and have the legal right to exclude trespassing individuals from this space. The manufacturer assumes no liability for the misuse of this product in violation of local, state, or federal law. She set the frequency to maximum. The intensity slider went from 1 to 10. She moved it to 7. Sarah submerged the device in the water at the deep end, using the weighted base to secure it to the pool floor. Then she climbed out, dried off, and went inside to wait. She didn't have to wait long. By 3 in the afternoon, she heard the familiar sounds of the fence being compromised. The metal slats were bent, the opening larger than ever. This time, there were at least 20 teenagers, and they were loud, like they owned the place. "Pool's open," someone shouted. "Let's go." The first one in was the tall boy from the first day, the one with the confidence and the refusal to apologize. He dove in from the deep end with Olympic precision. What happened next played out in slow motion in Sarah's mind, though it only took about 3 seconds in real time. The boy surfaced, sputtering. Then his face contorted. His hands flew to his head. He let out a sound, not quite a scream, not quite a yell, but something between pain and panic that made everyone freeze. "Get out," he shouted, thrashing toward the edge. "Get out, get out, get out, get out." His friends rushed to help him, pulling him out of the pool. He collapsed on the deck, gasping, his whole body trembling. Other kids were grabbing towels, backing away from the water. No one was moving toward the pool. "What the hell is wrong with him?" one girl asked. "I don't know," the boy said between gasps. "It felt like electricity, like my whole brain was vibrating. I can't describe it. It hurt." Sarah watched from the window of her living room, her heart hammering in her chest. She'd expected maybe some confusion, some discomfort that would send them away. She hadn't expected this. Within minutes they were gone, all of them, running, helping the tall boy who seemed to still be in distress back through the gap in the fence. Sarah stood in her kitchen, shaking. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. She'd installed something in her pool specifically to hurt people, even if the pain was temporary, even if it wasn't supposed to cause lasting harm. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt afraid. She pulled out her phone and called her therapist, Dr. Morrison. It was Saturday, so of course there was no answer. She left a message. "I need to talk about a decision I made. I think I might have done something. I'm not sure if it was right." That night, she disabled the device and pulled it from the pool. She sat in her backyard, watching the water settle, listening to the evening cicadas. The sun was setting over the neighbor's roof, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was beautiful. It was peaceful. It was over. For exactly 3 days, it was over. Then on Tuesday evening, Sarah heard raised voices in her backyard. She rushed to the window and saw them, the tall boy, the girl with the braids, and 3 others. They were standing at the edge of the pool, arguing. "I'm telling you," the tall boy was saying, "there's something in that pool, some kind of device. I felt it. When I went in last time, I felt it." Sarah's stomach twisted. "That's insane," the girl with braids said. "It's just a pool." "No, I'm serious. She's trying to hurt us. I'm going to report it." "Report what?" another voice asked. "That we were trespassing in her pool and she put up a security system." But then the tall boy did something Sarah hadn't anticipated. He pulled out his phone and started videotaping. He walked to the edge of the pool, pointed to the water, and spoke directly to the camera. "My name is Derek Paulson," he said clearly, "and I'm documenting the installation of a dangerous device in this residential pool. This woman is trying to harm teenagers. I'm going to make sure everyone knows about it." He posted to TikTok immediately. Sarah watched the video go up in real time from her phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the device. He'd tagged the neighborhood, their city, and something called Pool Justice. Within 20 minutes, it had 2,000 views. By the time she went to bed, it had 50,000. The headline on the local news website read, "Fairfield mother admits to installing sonic weapon in pool to deter teenage swimmers." They hadn't called it a sonic weapon. It was a marine perimeter defender. The AquaGuard website had been very clear about what it was and what it wasn't, but Nuance didn't sell papers, and the media wasn't interested in nuance. By Wednesday morning, Sarah's name was all over the internet. Comments ranged from people calling her a hero defending her property to others calling her a monster trying to hurt children. Some people wanted her arrested. Others wanted to buy the device and install one in their own pools. The TikTok video had morphed into something bigger. Derek had made 3 more videos, each one more dramatic than the last. In the most recent one, he'd actually gone back to the pool, while Sarah was at work, and filmed what he claimed was the device causing him harm. He'd made it look worse than it was, contorting his face, staggering backward, practically launching himself out of the water. "She tried to electrocute me," he shouted to the camera. "This woman tried to electrocute a teenager." It was a lie, technically. The device didn't electrocute anything. It emitted a frequency that created discomfort, but the fact didn't matter much. The video had 3 million views. Sarah's phone wouldn't stop ringing. News outlets wanted interviews. She hung up on all of them. Her ex-husband Michael had texted her a screenshot of the video with a single line. "This is exactly the kind of impulsive thing that caused our problems." She'd blocked him. Her sister Emma had called twice, but Sarah didn't pick up. She couldn't talk to anyone. The world had divided itself into 2 camps, those who thought she was justified and those who thought she was a criminal, and neither group wanted to hear a nuanced explanation of how she'd gotten here. By Thursday, Derek had a lawyer. A real lawyer, not some ambulance chaser, but someone from a legitimate personal injury firm. The lawyer's name was Richard Mansfield, and he was very good at making complicated issues sound simple. The defendant installed a device specifically designed to cause physical and psychological harm to minors, he said in a statement to the press that Sarah's neighbor filmed and texted to her. "This is not a security measure. This is an assault. We're exploring criminal charges as well as a civil suit for damages." Sarah's own lawyer, she'd called one Friday morning, panicked. was a woman named Patricia Hawthorne who'd handled her divorce. Patricia was expensive and sharp, with gray hair cut in a severe bob and reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck. "Here's the good news," Patricia said during their phone call. "You didn't actually hurt him. The device is legal to own and operate on your own property. The bad news is that Derek's family has money, a sympathetic narrative, and a very clever lawyer. They're going to make this look like you're a vindictive older woman who tried to weaponize your pool against teenagers." "But I didn't." "I know what you did," Patricia interrupted. "I know your logic, I know it makes sense, and I know you weren't trying to seriously hurt anyone, but that doesn't matter. What matters is what they can prove and what the public believes. Right now, the public believes you're a threat." Sarah went to bed at 8 p.m. that Friday night and didn't get out of bed until Monday morning. The weekend had been brutal. Reporters had camped out on her street. Someone had thrown a rock through her living room window with a note attached. "Monster." She'd called the police, but they seemed more interested in the device in her pool than in the vandalism. A detective named Walsh had shown up Saturday morning with questions that felt less like an investigation and more like an interrogation. "Did you intend to cause harm?" he'd asked. "No, but you did intend to cause discomfort." "I intended to discourage trespassing." "And you did this by submerging a device in the water that creates a sensation of pain." When he put it that way, it sounded terrible. By Monday, Derek's medical claims had escalated. He was seeing a therapist now. He developed anxiety about water and post-traumatic stress disorder from his experience. His parents had filed a police report. The police had actually opened a case against Sarah, reckless endangerment of a minor. Patricia called her that morning. "We need to talk about a settlement," she said. "No," Sarah replied. "I didn't do anything wrong." "That's not the question anymore. The question is what you're willing to pay to make this go away." Sarah hung up. She went to work that week, though she could barely function. She was a project manager for a medical device company, a job she'd held for 8 years and was actually quite good at. Her manager, Kevin, pulled her aside on Wednesday. "The company's getting some questions about your situation," he said delicately. "I want you to know that we support you, but some clients are expressing concern. I think it would be best if you took some time off, paid time off, obviously, just until this blows over." It was a corporate way of saying, hide. By Friday, Derek's lawyer had filed a civil suit seeking $250,000 in damages for physical harm, emotional trauma, psychological injury, and medical expenses. Patricia called again. "This is actually good news," she said. "Now we're in civil court, not criminal. That's much easier to defend, but I'm not going to lie, this is going to be expensive. My fee plus court costs plus potentially a settlement to make them go away. You're looking at $30,000, maybe $40,000 minimum." $40,000. That was almost as much as she'd spent on the pool. Sarah agreed to retain Patricia on a limited basis for $15,000. She put it on a credit card. That was money she'd been saving for something else, a vacation, maybe, or home repairs. Now it was gone, consumed by the fact that she'd tried to protect her own property. That Saturday, she woke up to find something new trending on Twitter, Pool Justice Warriors. It had started as a hashtag supporting Derek, but it had evolved into something bigger. People were sharing stories of their own home invasions, their own property theft, their own frustrations with the legal system. Sarah's case had become a symbol, proof that the system was broken, that property rights meant nothing, that you couldn't defend yourself without becoming a villain. One influencer with 2 million followers had posted, "Sarah Chen is a hero. Don't let mainstream media fool you. The real criminals are the ones invading her space." Another had posted, "Sarah Chen tried to hurt children. She needs to be prosecuted." The narrative had split in half, and neither side wanted to talk to her. They wanted to talk about her. They wanted to use her story to prove their own point about whatever issue they cared about. She was no longer a person. She'd become a symbol. On Sunday night, Sarah found herself in her backyard, looking at the pool. It was empty now. She drained it after the device became news. She couldn't bear to look at the water. The pool that had been therapy had become a crime scene in everyone else's mind. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number, "You deserve what's coming to you." Then another from a different number, "Don't give up. You were right to protect your property." Then another, "I know where you live." She called the police non-emergency line and reported the threats. They said they would look into it, which meant they wouldn't. Sarah sat on one of her lounge chairs. She'd kept them out, even with the pool empty, and cried. Not the elegant crying of someone in a drama, but the ugly, gasping crying of someone whose life had come apart at the seams. She'd tried to protect something that was hers, and for that, she'd become a target. By the time the second video surfaced, it was almost anticlimactic. It came out on Wednesday of the following week, posted by a different account but clearly related to Derek. It showed footage of what looked like Derek several months earlier trespassing in someone else's pool, and then in someone else's backyard, and then stealing a bicycle from a front porch. The video had a caption, "DEREKPAULSON caught committing multiple crimes." Within hours, news outlets started investigating. Turns out Derek had quite a history: breaking and entering, petty theft, vandalism. He'd gotten off on most of the charges due to being a minor, but he'd never actually faced any real consequences. And Derek's family had money because his father was a real estate developer who'd made his fortune through a series of questionable business practices that were the subject of ongoing federal investigation. None of this mattered to the court of public opinion, at least not immediately, but it mattered in rooms where lawyers worked. Patricia called Sarah with something approaching excitement. "This changes things," she said. "If Derek's got priors, we can actually paint him as a chronic trespasser. You can claim you didn't know his history, but you did know he was breaking in repeatedly, and you took reasonable steps to stop it." "I didn't know about his history," Sarah said. "You do now, and that's what matters. We can reframe this entirely." The suit was quietly settled 2 weeks later. Derek received $15,000 and a formal apology from Sarah. In exchange, Derek's family agreed to drop the criminal investigation and never publicly discuss the case again. It was a victory, technically, but Sarah had to pay her lawyer another $8,000, and she'd spent $15,000 on the settlement, and she'd drained her pool and lost 2 weeks of work, and received thousands of threats online, and been accused of trying to hurt children by half the internet. By October, Sarah had become invisible again, not because the world forgot about her. There were still occasional TikToks, still people who recognized her at the grocery store, but because the news cycle had moved on. There was a new scandal, a new injustice, a new person to crucify online. Sarah Chen and her pool were old news. She'd moved. Not far, just across town, to a more secured complex with a homeowners association that actually enforced rules. No pool. She'd specifically chosen a unit without one. She'd looked at the listings and thought, never again. The old house had sold in September for $120,000 less than she'd originally paid for it. The realtor blamed market conditions. Sarah knew better. The house was infamous. People didn't want to live in a place that had been the site of an internet scandal. They didn't want their children playing in a backyard that might get them attacked by the internet. She'd gotten a new job, too. Same company, different office. Kevin had helped arrange it quietly. "Fresh start," he'd said. "You've been cleared of any wrongdoing and the company stands by you, but maybe a new team, new clients, new environment would be good." Translation: please stop being a problem. Sarah worked now in the suburban office, taking calls from clients she'd never meet, managing projects she didn't particularly care about. She'd become the kind of person who simply existed, going through the motions of being alive without actually living. She didn't think about Derek often. She thought about the pool more. It was strange, the way the pool had become symbolic of her failure. She tried to create something beautiful, something that belonged to her alone, something that made her happy, and it had been weaponized, not by her, though she'd wielded it, but by the situation, by Derek's family's legal aggression, by the internet's thirst for conflict. The pool had become a metaphor for her entire life, in a way that made her want to laugh and scream simultaneously. In late October, about 4 months after the incident, Sarah got a phone call from a blocked number. She almost didn't answer. She'd stopped answering calls from blocked numbers months ago, but something made her pick up. "Ms. Chen, this is Detective Walsh from the police department. Do you have a moment?" Her stomach dropped. "What's happened?" "Nothing's happened to you. I just wanted to give you a heads up. Derek Paulson was arrested last night for breaking into a home in Riverside. He's 17. He and 2 accomplices broke in, tied up the homeowner, and ransacked the place. We're still recovering stolen items." Sarah sat down on her couch. Is anyone hurt? The homeowner's physically fine, emotionally shaken. They're considering pressing charges. I wanted to call you because, well, you should know. After she hung up, Sarah sat in silence for a long time. She thought about going to Derek's trial, but what would that accomplish? To say, I told you so? To watch his punishment and feel vindicated? She didn't want vindication anymore. She just wanted to feel normal. In November, she went to see Dr. Morrison, her therapist. They'd been working together again after a gap of several months. I keep thinking about what I did, Sarah told her. Not the device. I mean, yes, the device, but beyond that. I keep thinking about the moment I decided it was okay to hurt someone, even temporarily, even as a deterrent, because they were violating my space. Do you regret it? Dr. Morrison asked. I regret the consequences. I don't know if I regret the action itself. That's the problem. I genuinely don't know. What do you think that means? I think it means I'm not the person I thought I was. I thought I was someone who followed the rules, who made good decisions, who did the right thing. But when my back was against the wall, I found a legal way to hurt people. And I did it. And part of me doesn't regret that. Dr. Morrison made a note. That's not necessarily a bad thing, you know. It might mean you're capable of defending your boundaries, even in ways that society doesn't approve of. Society didn't approve, Sarah said. And now there are probably 1,000 people online who still think I should be arrested. Probably, but there are also probably 1,000 people who think you were justified. The internet loves both vindication and condemnation in equal measure. It's not the arbiter of morality. But it was, in a way. The internet had decided what Sarah was, and while the judgment had split, she'd never be able to go back to who she was before. She'd always be the pool woman, the person who tried to hurt kids. Even if her reasoning was understandable, even if Derek deserved it. That was the part that kept her awake at night, the fact that Derek had deserved it. He'd been breaking into her property repeatedly. He'd been trespassing. He'd been invading her space. And later evidence showed he'd been doing this to other people too. He'd been stealing, vandalizing, invading. The device had worked. It had stopped him. And now he was facing real consequences for actual crimes. In a just world, this would have been fine. In a just world, Sarah would have been able to say, I protected my property from a criminal, and that criminal is now being prosecuted for his actual crimes, and everyone is safe. But we don't live in a just world. We live in a world where timing matters, where narrative matters, where the internet's attention span is shorter than a goldfish's memory. Derek had played the victim first, and that story had stuck even after it turned out he was also a criminal. In December, Sarah got a letter from Patricia Hawthorne. It was forwarded to her new address, and it contained a check for $3,000. As you know, the letter stated, the settlement agreement stipulated that Derek would pay damages to your homeowner's insurance for the window he broke and the property damage caused by his trespassing. The county civil court has ordered that this $3,000 be returned to you as recompense. I'm enclosing the check. I'm also enclosing my final bill for this case. We should consider this matter fully resolved. Sarah looked at the two pieces of paper. One a check for $3,000, $1 a bill for $12,000 in additional legal fees Patricia was billing for administrative closure. So the net effect of Derek's recompense was that Sarah paid Patricia another $9,000. She laughed, she actually laughed, alone in her apartment with no one to share the joke with. It was absurd. It was perfectly, absolutely absurd. That night she deleted all her social media accounts. Not deactivated, deleted. She couldn't stand looking at the news stories anymore, or the comments, or the new arguments that erupted every few weeks when someone found the old video and decided to restart the debate. By the end of December, Sarah had systematized her life into something manageable. She went to work, she came home, she made dinner, she watched television, she went to therapy. She lived a life that was small and safe and devoid of anything that could become a symbol or a scandal. It was a life without joy, but it was a life without conflict. In January, someone knocked on Sarah's apartment door on a Saturday morning. She was in her kitchen with coffee, not expecting company. She hadn't invited anyone to her new place. Hadn't really been in contact with anyone at all besides her family, and even that was minimal. She checked the peephole. A woman stood in the hallway, someone Sarah didn't recognize. Mid-60s, maybe, with kind eyes and a cardigan that matched Sarah's own aesthetic almost exactly. Sarah opened the door. "Can I help you?" Hi, the woman said. My name is Margaret. I'm Derek Paulson's paternal grandmother. I'm probably the last person you want to see, and I'll completely understand if you tell me to leave. But I drove all the way from Sacramento, and I really need to talk to you. Sarah's first instinct was to close the door. Her second instinct was to listen to the alarm bells ringing in her head. But then she saw that Margaret's eyes were wet like she'd been crying, and Sarah, who'd been broken by too much conflict, found she didn't have the energy to refuse her. She let Margaret into her apartment. They sat across from each other at Sarah's small kitchen table, coffee between them that Sarah had hastily poured. I want to apologize, Margaret said without preamble, for what my grandson put you through, for what my family did to you, for everything. You don't need to apologize, Sarah said, though this was a lie. Everyone needed to apologize. The entire situation had been an apology-worthy mess. I do actually. You need to know something about Derek, about his family, about why this happened. Margaret wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. Derek's father, my son, he's not a good man. He's never been a good man. He's cut corners his whole life, hurt people for profit, convinced himself that the rules don't apply to him, and he's taught Derek the same thing. Sarah said nothing. Last year, Derek's mother left, Margaret continued. She finally got tired of watching her husband hurt people. She left with enough money to take Derek and my other grandchildren, but Derek refused to go. He sided with his father, and ever since then his father has been, I don't know what to call it, using him, training him, encourages him to break rules, to push boundaries, because his father believes that authority is just something to be challenged and overcome. I'm sorry, Sarah said, but I don't know what you want me to do with this information. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm telling you because you should know. What Derek did to you wasn't really about you or your pool. You were just the person he was encouraged to target by his father. Your home was chosen because it seemed easy, and there's no greater motivation for my son than finding something that seems easy to exploit. Margaret pulled out her phone and showed Sarah a series of text messages. They were between Margaret and her son, Derek's father. Did you tell the boy to mess with the old woman's pool? One read. It's good for him, teaches him not to fear consequences, was the reply. He's terrified, he's having nightmares. The device hurt him, Richard. He deserved it. He should learn that there are consequences to getting caught. Sarah felt something cold move through her. Derek hadn't just decided on his own to break into her pool. He'd been sent, encouraged, trained to do it by his own father. I wanted you to know, Margaret said, because I want you to know that none of this was actually about you. You did what any reasonable person would do when faced with repeated trespassing. And you were made into a villain because my family decided to make you one. That wasn't fair to you. Is Derek still? Sarah trailed off, not sure what she was asking. In juvenile detention pending trial, yes. Apparently this house he broke into was the final straw. The judge was not sympathetic, and Derek's father has decided that Derek is now a liability rather than an asset, so he's not paying for his defense. Derek's got a public defender and the prognosis isn't good. Sarah felt something then, not satisfaction exactly, but something close to it. A sense that balance had in some way been restored. Derek had faced consequences, not for the pool, but for the actual crimes he'd been committing. Thank you for telling me, Sarah said finally. And I accept your apology. For what it's worth, I think you came here because you're trying to do something right. That counts for something. Margaret smiled, sad and tired. I came here because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. My son is my son, and I love him even though he's become a terrible person. But I can't protect him from the consequences of what he's done. I can only try to clean up after him. They talked for another hour. Margaret told Sarah about her family, about Derek's mother, who'd started a new life in Oregon, about Margaret's other grandchildren, who she was fighting to maintain a relationship with despite their father's interference. About the guilt she carried for the fact that she hadn't seen this coming, that she hadn't protected Derek from becoming what his father was grooming him to become. When Margaret left, Sarah walked her to the door. One more thing, Margaret said. The incident with Derek's father, the federal investigation I'm sure you read about. It's moving faster now. There's someone at his company who finally came forward. It looks like the real consequences are coming for him. Not just for what happened to you, but for the bigger picture of what he's been doing. After Margaret left, Sarah sat in her apartment in silence. She felt strange, lighter somehow, but also hollowed out. The story hadn't ended where she thought it would. Derek wasn't a villain entirely of his own making. He was a victim of his father's cruelty, and his father wasn't a powerful man who'd escape consequences. He was falling, apparently, just very slowly. Justice, Sarah realized, was never as clean as anyone wanted it to be. By spring, Richard Paulson, Derek's father, the real estate developer, had been indicted on 14 counts of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. It turned out that cutting corners was an understatement. His business had been built on actively defrauding clients, bribing inspectors, and covering up major safety violations. One of the properties his company had built had collapsed during construction, killing 2 workers. Both deaths had been ruled accidental, but the evidence suggested they might have been preventable if Richard had actually followed safety protocols. An internal whistleblower had come forward with documents that suggested Richard knew about the safety risks and chose profit over precaution. The news outlets that had been so focused on Sarah and the pool suddenly pivoted to covering a much bigger story. Richard Paulson became the villain in a much more significant narrative: federal crime, corporate malfeasance, deaths caused by greed. Sarah watched all of this from her apartment, and she felt nothing. Or rather, she felt a complex mixture of nothing: satisfaction and vindication and sadness and exhaustion all at once. Derek, meanwhile, had taken a plea deal. He was being tried as a juvenile for the home invasion and burglary charges. He'd pled guilty and was sentenced to 18 months in juvenile detention, followed by 2 years of probation. His lawyer had argued that Derek was a victim of his father's influence, and the judge seemed to have considered the sentence was relatively lenient, all things considered. In May, Sarah received a letter. It was from Derek, sent through Patricia Hawthorne, who'd forwarded it to her new address. Ms. Chen, I don't know if you'll even read this, and I don't know what I'm supposed to say. I wanted to apologize for what I did to your property and for the trouble I caused. I also wanted you to know that I know now that my dad was using me, that he was training me to be like him. I don't want to be like him. My therapist says I should try to make amends where possible. So I'm trying. I hope you're okay. I'm sorry. Derek. Sarah read the letter several times. It was genuine, she thought, or at least it seemed genuine. Derek was in juvenile detention with nothing to gain from flattery or manipulation. He was just a kid who'd figured out too late that his father had been grooming him to be a criminal. She didn't respond to the letter. She couldn't quite bring herself to do it. But she kept it in a drawer in her nightstand where she wouldn't have to look at it but also wouldn't throw it away. By late spring, Sarah had started to emerge from the small, safe life she'd constructed. She went out for dinner with Emma, her sister, for the first time in months. Emma had wanted to support her the whole time, but Sarah had isolated herself so thoroughly that she'd nearly lost the relationship. I've been a terrible sister, Sarah said as they ate salad at a restaurant that was carefully chosen to be anonymous enough that nobody would recognize her. You've been traumatized, Emma corrected. There's a difference. Also, you've been going through something that I can barely imagine. Having your life picked apart by the internet, having your actions judged by strangers, having to relive everything over and over. I put something in my pool to hurt teenagers, Sarah said. I don't really get to complain about being judged. That was objectively a bad decision. It was a decision made under extreme duress by a woman whose property was being invaded repeatedly and who felt unsupported by law enforcement or any official mechanism. It was imperfect, but I wouldn't call it bad. Sarah smiled at her sister. You're being very generous. I'm being honest. Also, did you hear about Derek's father? Yeah, it's everywhere. Well, there's some symmetry to that, at least. He trained his son to break into your property, and now he's the one facing real consequences for his own criminal behavior. Maybe that's something. After dinner, Sarah went home and did something she hadn't done in months. She looked up the news about Richard Paulson's trial. It was starting in June. The evidence was damning. Between the whistleblower's documents, the emails, and the testimony from dozens of former employees, the prosecution seemed to have a case that was essentially airtight. Sarah read about the families of the 2 workers who died in the building collapse. They'd been without fathers for years because Richard Paulson had decided that cutting corners was worth more than following regulations. She thought about Derek, sitting in juvenile detention, figuring out that his father had been using him. She thought about Derek's mother, who'd apparently started a new life in Oregon and refused to testify on her ex-husband's behalf. She thought about Margaret, driving from Sacramento to apologize for her son's crimes. And she thought about herself, a woman who'd tried to defend her property and had ended up as a symbol in a culture war about property rights and teenage punishment, and whether the internet should decide who was good or bad. In June, Richard Paulson was convicted on 12 of the 14 counts. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. His company was shut down. His assets were seized. His professional reputation was destroyed. Derek would get out of juvenile detention in about a year. He told his therapist that he wanted to go to college, that he wanted to study engineering and architecture, specifically to learn how to build things safely. It was a small redemption in the face of everything, but Sarah thought it was something. 1 year after the incident, almost exactly, Sarah found herself walking through an open house in her old neighborhood. She didn't mean to, it was just that she was driving past, and she saw the sign in the yard and something made her pull in. The house was being sold again. It had changed hands twice since Sarah sold it. The new owners had apparently not been able to handle the notoriety of the place and were cutting their losses. The listing described the house as a beautiful mid-century home with great bones in a desirable neighborhood. The pool was still there, but it had been drained and left empty for so long that the concrete was cracking. Nobody wanted to use it. Nobody wanted to look at it. Sarah walked around the backyard, looking at her old lounge chairs. She'd left them behind, not wanting to keep any reminder of this place. They were faded now, left out in the sun for too long. The fence she'd paid to have reinforced had been taken down, and new fencing had been installed in its place. It was strange being here. Everything was the same and completely different. A real estate agent approached her. "Are you interested in the property? We can arrange a viewing of the interior." "I used to live here," Sarah said. The agent's face changed immediately. Not in a mean way, but in that careful way people change their faces when they realize they're talking to someone they recognize. "Oh," she said. "Oh, you're—" "Yeah, that's me." The agent didn't quite know what to say. Sarah understood. She was simultaneously a victim of a viral incident, a woman who'd taken questionable action to defend her property, and now just a person standing in a backyard, looking at a pool that didn't belong to her anymore. "I'm sorry," the agent said finally. "That whole thing was, I'm sorry you went through that." "Are you," Sarah asked, not unkindly, "or are you more interested in the fact that it might make the house harder to sell?" "Both," the agent admitted with a sad smile. "I really am sorry, though. It was a rough situation for everyone involved." Sarah left shortly after. She drove away from the house, from the neighborhood, from the place that had become famous for all the wrong reasons. She thought about the pool, about how it had started as a symbol of her own recovery and independence, and had become a symbol of the internet's hunger for judgment and conflict. But maybe that was the real story. Not about the pool itself, but about what happens when a private space becomes public, when a personal conflict becomes a national debate, when one woman's attempt to defend her own boundaries gets weaponized by people with agendas and algorithms. Sarah thought about Derek in juvenile detention, about Richard Paulson in federal prison, about Margaret's guilt and apologies, about her own complicity in an escalation that had seemed justified at every step but had added up to something excessive in the aggregate. She thought about how every person in that incident had been trying to defend something. Derek defending his relationship with his father, Richard defending his profits, Sarah defending her property, the internet defending its view of justice, and how all of that defense had crashed together into a moment of viral chaos that destroyed everyone involved. That night, Sarah sat on her couch with a glass of wine and did something she hadn't done in over a year. She read through some of the old comments on the TikTok videos, the ones she'd saved before everything was taken down. Some people had called her a hero, standing up to trespassing teenagers, protecting her property. "I wish I had the guts to do what she did." Others had called her a monster, trying to hurt kids. "This woman is a criminal, lock her up." And then there were the comments from people who'd actually thought about it, who'd actually engaged with the complexity. "This situation is sad because everyone's doing what they think is right, and it's all going wrong. The real criminals are the ones raising kids to think they can just take what they want. Why don't we have better systems for dealing with property disputes that don't involve making anyone famous?" That last comment had stuck with Sarah. It was true, wasn't it? The real failure wasn't on her part or entirely on Derek's. The real failure was a system where a woman had to take matters into her own hands because nobody else would help, and a system where a teenager could be groomed by his father into criminal behavior with barely a consequence until he did something really serious. Sarah closed her laptop and poured another glass of wine. She thought about what Margaret had said. I came here because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. Maybe that was what Sarah needed to do. Maybe she needed to find some way to make peace with what had happened that didn't involve carrying the weight of it forever. In August, Sarah volunteered for a legal advocacy group that worked with teenagers in the criminal justice system. She didn't tell anyone her story. She just helped, attending court dates with kids who didn't have family support, connecting them with resources, listening to their situations. She met a lot of kids who reminded her of Derek. Kids who'd been set up for failure by their circumstances, their families, their schools, their world. Kids who were being punished, often deservedly, but also kids who were being given a chance to become something other than what their circumstances suggested they'd be. One kid, a girl named Myra who'd been arrested for shoplifting to feed her siblings because her mother was struggling with addiction, asked Sarah why she volunteered. Because I know what it's like, Sarah said, to feel like the system let you down, and I wanted to try to do better for someone else. It wasn't the whole truth. It wasn't even the core truth, but it was a truth, and it was one that Sarah could live with. By fall, the pool incident had completely faded from the national consciousness. There was always something new to be outraged about, something new to defend or condemn. Sarah Chen and her sonic device had been relegated to the category of old internet drama that nobody quite remembered correctly. She was okay with that. She was more than okay with that. In December, Patricia Hawthorne sent her a bill for some final administrative closure. Sarah was about to ignore it when she noticed something. Patricia had written on the invoice, I wanted you to know that Derek Paulson reached out to my office asking if there was a way to contact you. He wanted to know if his apology was received and if there was any way he could make further amends. I told him that the matter was settled, but I wanted you to be aware that he's still thinking about what he did. I don't know what that means to you, but I thought you should know. Sarah stared at that note for a long time. Derek was still thinking about it. Even in juvenile detention, even with everything else going on in his life, he was still thinking about what he'd done to her. She called Patricia back and asked how to contact Derek. Patricia was hesitant. There were privacy concerns, but ultimately she provided an address for the juvenile detention facility and information about how to send a letter. Sarah sat down and wrote a letter. It took her 3 days to get the words right. She wrote about what she'd learned from the incident, about how she'd come to understand that Derek was a victim of his circumstances, even though what he'd done was still wrong, about how she'd realized that her decision to install the device had been understandable but still not the right choice, about how she hoped that Derek could become something other than what his father had tried to make him into. I don't forgive you, she wrote, but I understand you, and I hope that's worth something. She sealed the letter and sent it. 2 months later, she received a response. Ms. Chen, thank you for your letter. I wanted you to know that what you said about understanding, that means a lot to me. I've been thinking about what happened, and I've realized that I made bad choices even if my dad was encouraging them. I'm trying to do better. I'm going to school here. I know it sounds fake, but I'm getting my GED and taking some college prep classes. When I get out, I want to study something meaningful. Your letter helped me understand that I can actually become something different than what I was being pushed toward. I'm not going to ask you to forgive me. I understand that. But I wanted you to know that your decision to respond meant something to me. It meant that you saw me as a person, not just as someone who did something wrong. That's something I didn't think I deserved. I'm sorry for what I did. I mean that. Derek. Sarah read the letter once, then put it in her drawer with his first letter. And then, for the first time in over a year, she felt something like peace. Sarah stood in a backyard again, but it was different this time. It was her sister Emma's house, and there was a pool, a small above-ground one that Emma and her family had installed the previous summer. You're sure you're okay being back around a pool? Emma asked, handing her a drink. I'm sure, Sarah said. It's just water. Emma's kids were splashing in the pool, playing some complicated game that only made sense to them. Sarah sat in a lounge chair and watched them, feeling the warm sun on her skin. She'd got her old job back, just in a different department. The company had wanted to make amends for how they'd handled the situation, and she'd wanted to move forward so they'd come to an understanding. She was doing good work, and more importantly, she was doing work she cared about. She was also dating someone, a teacher named Marcus who she'd met through the legal advocacy group. He knew about the pool incident. He'd looked it up, found the old videos and articles, and then looked at Sarah with compassionate eyes and said, "That sounds like a really complicated situation. I'm glad you're okay." And she was okay, not unchanged. The experience had fundamentally altered her sense of what was possible, what was safe, what was fair. But okay. Derek had been released from juvenile detention the previous month. According to Margaret, who Sarah still heard from occasionally, Derek had enrolled in college. He was studying civil engineering with a focus on sustainable building practices. He'd written Sarah a letter when he got out, but Sarah had asked Margaret to tell him that they should both move forward with their lives. Sometimes healing meant not reliving things, and Sarah was done reliving. Richard Paulson was still in federal prison. His company had been dismantled. The families of the workers who died in the building collapse had received settlements, though no amount of money could bring back their fathers. The internet had moved on, as the internet always did. There were new scandals, new viral moments, new people to judge. Sarah Chen and her pool were footnotes in the vast archive of internet drama, occasionally resurfaced by TikTokers who were too young to remember when it was actually happening. "You know," Emma said, sitting down next to Sarah, "I'm really proud of you, for how you handled everything afterward, for volunteering, for moving forward, for not getting bitter." "I don't know if I didn't get bitter," Sarah said. "I think I got bitter and then chose to do something about it." "That's actually better than not being bitter in the first place. That's character." Sarah watched the kids in the pool and thought about Derek, probably sitting in a college classroom somewhere, learning how to build things that wouldn't collapse. She thought about Margaret, who was still trying to figure out how to have a relationship with her son despite the weight of what he'd done. She thought about all the people whose lives had been touched by that moment when she'd installed a device in her pool and changed everything. "Do you ever regret it?" Emma asked, "putting the device in the pool?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I regret how it turned out. I regret the viral moment, the internet's judgment, all of that, but the decision itself, no, I don't think I regret it. I was trying to protect something that was mine. I made an imperfect choice, but I made it for understandable reasons. I've learned to live with that." Emma squeezed her hand. That night, Sarah went home to her apartment and looked out the window at the city lights. She thought about the past 3 years, the violence of the viral moment, the slow work of recovery, the gradual understanding that complexity doesn't resolve into simple narratives. She thought about how she tried to protect her property and had ended up protecting something more important: her ability to move forward, to learn, to see people, including herself, as complicated and deserving of understanding rather than judgment. She opened her laptop and did something she hadn't done in 3 years. She searched for her own name. There were still articles, there were still videos, but the discourse had changed. Years of reflection had added nuance to the story. Some articles now framed it as a case study in how social media outrage could obscure complexity. Others used it as an example of property rights debates or the juvenile justice system. A few even mentioned Sarah's volunteer work, though they seemed surprised that she'd chosen to help at-risk youth rather than become bitter or retreat entirely. She closed the laptop and poured herself a glass of wine. She thought about Derek, somewhere in a classroom learning to build things. She thought about Margaret, still trying. She thought about the internet, still searching for the next person to decide was good or bad, hero or villain. And she thought about herself, Sarah Chen, the pool woman, a person who'd made an imperfect choice under imperfect circumstances and had somehow emerged from it changed but whole. She'd installed a sonic device in her pool to keep teenagers out. What she'd actually discovered was something far more important. She discovered that justice was never as clean as anyone wanted it to be. That understanding didn't require forgiveness. That growth came from sitting with complexity rather than running from it. She discovered that sometimes the most important boundaries we protect are not the ones around our property, but the ones around our capacity for compassion. And in a world that loved to divide people into simple categories, heroes and villains, right and wrong, Sarah had discovered the rarest thing of all: